Good evening. Thank you for joining me tonight for tonight's Bible study. We begin tonight our journey through this book called The Story, which again I will remind you is really just reading through the Bible. It's not every bit of the Bible, but it is the narrative of the Bible, the focus on the people and the events that happen through scriptures. It is the actual text of the Bible. In this case, it's the NIV. You may have, by the way, an older version that looks like this, but it is the same book. Same chapters, same page numbers will apply. So we'll be reading the same text. And what it will do, it will take us from the beginning, from Genesis chapter 1 through Revelations, and we'll just take glances and pieces as we read through the entirety of the Bible and try and get a handle on the whole of God's Word. And so what I really hope that we'll accomplish are two things. One is look at the actual text, get ourselves time to read the actual words as they're written. I think too often, if we haven't really spent a ton of time actually reading the Bible, we have assumptions that we've made about what's in there or what it says. And I always think that part of how we have to be responsible about our reading of the Bible is to actually read the text. Of course, we're reading a translation of the Bible, and there will be points, and I'll try to make a couple of those, where we're looking deeper into that translation, that text would be valuable for us too, kind of as well. And of course, my hope is to give you some short presentations here, 20 minutes or so, on each of these sections as we go through, which means I'm not going to be able to talk about the whole of the readings. If you have questions about things I don't talk about, I hope that you'll bring those questions to me as you can. But I want to give you some tools. I want to give you some insights that I hope will provide context for the whole of the reading. Because as I said in a Bible study I did a couple of months ago about reading the Bible, that's what's really essential for us, is to understand the context, both of how the words and how the stories and how the writings felt and sounded and were experienced in their original to their first readers, and then the context that they create for us, both in just the situation in which we live and in the ways in which they draw us to experience God's Word in our own kind of times and places. So, remind you again, either one of those books are available at most places where you can buy books. It is also available on Kindle. And I have even loaded it on the church's Kindles if you want to borrow one of those to read it there as well. Just get a hold of me and I'll get one checked out for you. As always, if you have questions or comments, use the comment section on Facebook to do those, or reach out to me directly by email or whatever. My hope is that maybe as we get into the fall and vaccination levels increase in our area, that perhaps we'll even be able to gather in person as we go through this study. But for now, we're just going to begin by doing it online. So let's begin our reading of the story. Tonight we're going to talk about chapter 1, which it creates the creation stories. There are two creation stories. And I guess that's probably just a great place for us to start as we think about how the Bible is put together and what it means for us as we come to it as well. So there's one story that happens in chapter 1 to just bleeds over into the beginning of chapter 2. And that is the classic, on the first day, God said, let there be light, and there was light, and it was good. And it's this beautiful piece of poetry. And it's written and constructed in such a fashion that makes it easily rememberable. It makes it easy to be recited. And I think in very many ways that's sort of how it functioned. And then the creation story in chapters 2 and 3 is the story of the Garden of Eden, but Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and how that all goes. What I want to do is kind of focus, just catch a piece of the first of the two creation stories tonight. Again, I think this just provides us a way to talk about how the text functions and how it kind of works. So I'm going to jump here into chapter 1, and in what is probably one of the key sort of pieces. And again, I think it will give us an idea of how it is do we read this material. And again, this is one of those places where we can have that very serious conversation about, this notion of fundamentalism and reading the Bible just simply literally. 7 days means 7 days. And frankly, even trying to put some kind of of a time frame on that notion of a day. Well, the day is this many years or something like that. Just gets us tied up in knots. But worse than that is it pulls us away from reading it as it's meant to be. Because again, this first chapter is poetry. And so it's not meant to be read as science. And frankly, I don't think it's meant to be read as history either. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I want you to notice something about with this part here. It's about verse 26 or so. This is the sixth day. This is where God creates humans. And it says, Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Okay, so I'm hoping that a couple things just jumped right out at you. And the first one I think that ought to always get us is this notion of God saying, let us make humankind. Right? What is this plural to which God is referring? Is God referring to this some heavenly court? Right? God is working with the angels here to make creation. Is this just a royal plural? Is this just a trick of translation? Because the Hebrew word for God is, in fact, actually a plural word in most of its translation. Right? It challenges us, I think, to think in a larger sense again about how we're kind of reading. Here's another word that ought to get us engaged. God wants to make humans in his image. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Do we see that just simply as a physical reflection of the human form? Does it mean that somehow we bear in ourselves, and this is, I think, how we hear that, some notion of the divine presence? It's a great word to wrestle with, and I think it ought to be what draws us to this passage. But the reason I want to grab things like that is because there's so much more going on here than just what meets the eye. And this lovely language and poetry here gets lost when we get tangled up with two particular words. One is this word, have dominion. You hear in there that word for dominate, right? And this is kind of the standard translation of that passage as well. But that word does not mean dominion in the way that we think of it as cruelty. It's not about being tyrannical. Sometimes we take this notion of our existence in the world to mean that this world was made for our use, and we can do whatever we want to it. And obviously that seems to be the way that we live. We do whatever we want to the creation, and we've given up on the notion that it was good or that it served any kind of purpose. And so we abuse the creation because we think that's what it means to dominate, to subdue. Really, the word is more tied to the notion of stewardship. And a steward is a person who is responsible to care for something that does not belong to them. A steward is a servant. And so the steward's job is to care for the master's property and to make sure that it always shows regard for the one who made it. And so that sense of proper caretaking is really what's kind of in there. The other verse, of course, the other piece of this that I want to key is this phrase, right? Male and female, he created him. And there's a phrase that we use often, again, as a weapon. That's one of those ways that we like to use the Bible as kind of a weapon. Well, there's only male and female. And so we use that to try to box people into certain identities and ways of living. But compare that to this phrase here. God commands the humans to be fruitful and multiply. So if this is a literal kind of phrase here, that we can only be male and female, do we also then mean that this is to be taken literally? That if you don't bear children in the world, that somehow you are also breaking the nature of God's creation, that we can only exist to bear children? Does that mean people who cannot have children are somehow going against God's design in the world? Of course not. And in fact, throughout the scriptures there are often stories of people who were childless, whom God then came and blessed. Right? God has the capacity to bless everyone. And again, to read this creation story as if somehow it was meant to be this weapon that we could use, this way of saying, well, this is how it has to be, is to miss entirely on the beauty of the story and how it draws us into this notion that we live in this great gift of a creation that God made for us. A word again about the two creation stories. And again, this is part of why we have to read these with bigger eyes and with a more open heart. They are exactly the opposite of one another. In the first creation, in chapter 1, God first creates the land and the sea, the lights and so on, and then He creates the land, and then the plants, and then the trees, and the fish and the birds, and then the land animals, and then human beings. In chapters 2 and 3, first God creates the person, Adam, and then He creates the garden, and then He creates the animals, and then finally Adam's helper, and then He creates Eve, right? Almost completely exactly the opposite order in the two. For that makes it difficult for me to read these too simply and not see that there's something greater going on. But let me show you something else that I think is fun about the creation stories. There is an evolution to the way that the creation operates, to the design of the creation, that becomes kind of obvious when you look at two verses. So this is verse 29 from chapter 1. God says, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food." In the Genesis 1 story, the humans are to eat the plants. They are to be vegetarians. Right? The animals have their own life, and if we go strictly by the way that the way that chapter 1, the way the creation stories are written, then we are to just be plant-eating beings. Not necessarily a bad thing. We all need a little bit more plant-based food in our diet anyway, right? But later in Genesis, in chapter 9, in the Noah story, we find this. "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." So the nature of the creation and our relationship to it changes in just 9 chapters from being we're supposed to be vegetarian to, well, we can eat anything that we want to, right? The story evolves through time. The story changes, the expectations, the understandings of life and the nature of who we are and how we interact with the creation changes. And so this notion that we can read Genesis chapter 1 and just say, this is it, as if it was just that simple, really goes against, in fact, how the whole of the scriptures read. But what's important is that we do not miss what is the most significant part of the creation stories in Genesis chapter 1, and that's this idea. At the beginning of chapter 2, this is the end of the first creation story. It says, "On the seventh day God finished all the work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all the work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because God rested from all the work that He had done in creation." If anyone asks you how many the days that God created the world, and they say 7, no, He created it in 6. And on the 7th, He created something called Sabbath, which becomes a key principle, a key spiritual value of faith throughout the entirety of the Scriptures. This notion of setting aside part of life from the busy work of life, from taking this time that is set aside for something else, for something purposeful, for something spiritual. And as we go through the story, we'll catch again and again the importance of Sabbath, and we'll be constantly challenged to have that raised up as an important scriptural principle, that there is more to life than just simply the work of creating, the work of doing. There's an aspect of being that is much greater than just what we build, and that's Sabbath. And that is, in its own way, the most important part, I think, of the first of the creation stories. This notion of a day set aside a day of rest, but we could certainly spend some time talking about what rest means and how that functions, and then we will as we go forward. But it's fascinating that we get caught up in the details of the creation stories and we miss its real purpose. Scholars believe that the creation story in Genesis 1 was actually written later than the creation story in Genesis 2. And you can, I think, feel that a little bit just in terms of the sophistication of the language and the construction of the stories. They were carried for a long time by the Israel and became part of the scriptures, and as all of the scriptures came to be over the course of time. But the first creation story serves a particular function in that it's written in such a fashion as to highlight the people's worship life, and not just simply to be an historical or somehow scientific, in whatever way that existed in pre-biblical times, a piece of evidence, right? It has a much greater function, and that's why we read this, to understand what does that story mean to me? What am I to understand about the creation and the way that God created the world that shapes the way I live out my faith and the way that I build my relationship with God? And the answer to that question is, I learn how to do Sabbath. And by doing that, that draws me closer to the God of all creation. I want to grab one other piece here, and that's the Noah story. Because the Noah story, again, something we've learned since we were little children, right? We treat it as a children's story. It is far from that, right? Because this is how the Noah story begins. With this very adult idea. It says, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. These are very hard words, and what do we do with those? I think the struggle is, of course, is that what we want to do is we want to apply them to someone else. Again, part of what we need to learn to not do is use the Bible as a weapon against others. But what does it mean for us just to simply hear these words and let them rest upon us? To think about what it means that as we are corrupted, as we are ruined or destroyed, right, as we are not who God made us to be, not living out the covenant God made with us, as we are violent and destructive of the world and of each other, that goes against God's ways, and that there's a consequence to that. That somehow our behaviors, our failures, our shortcomings, our inability to live up to our responsibility has consequences. And we're going to circle back to this again because, of course, part of the story of Noah is that is a one-shot kind of, one-off kind of deal. Yet the truth of it is that we don't often think about those things in these terms. Now, you'll also notice that it's in plural, right? All the earth was filled with violence, not just some people. Again, too often we want to play the notion of faith as about you being naughty and this person's naughty behavior and that person's naughty behavior. As if God was like Santa Claus watching us and making his list and checking it twice, and some nice children get toys and naughty children get lumps of coal. This is a God watching over the whole of his creation, who has a very particular kind of expectation about how it will be and how his people will live in it and how they will act. And this constant running story through all of the scriptures of this constant falling short, and how does God react to that? How does God react to our brokenness? How does God react to our failures and our shortcomings? And that knowledge, how does that shape the way we understand the things that we do? Sometimes it's just too easy for us to sort of write off, well, the world's a bad place, people are bad, that's how it goes. The Noah's Ark story really asks us to think a little bit more seriously about the consequences of our world, of the culture we have built, of the way that we contribute to the way that the world is. And when we think about problems, when we think about poverty and injustice and racism and violence and anger and all of those things. Not just to say, well, that's just part of how people are, but to understand, no, that's not how part of how people were made to be, not how God wants us to be. And to take some responsibility for that. That's really what drives the whole story of Noah's Ark, is this idea that God actually cares about the way that we do things as a whole, as a society, as a culture. Not just about how naughty some people are, but that God looks upon the whole of his creation, and his heart breaks for the things that we get wrong. Of course, then there's Noah, right? God picks up Noah, and he says, now, Noah evidently is different from the rest of the world. Noah is the one righteous person, Noah and his family. And so God is going to lift them out and save them even as he destroys the whole of the world. And it sort of establishes what will be a common theme throughout all of the Hebrew Scriptures, that God is constantly choosing his people, constantly setting aside his own people, constantly saving his particular people for a particular purpose. And ultimately, I think that's what Noah's value is in this story. Noah's righteousness is that he is the one whom God has chosen. Because you'll notice what happens at the end of the Noah story. After they survived the flood, after the ark lands safely, it says, Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and he became drunk, and he lay uncovered, naked, in his tent. Right? Noah's righteousness has nothing to do with Noah himself. Noah is as capable of fault as anyone is. And in fact, again, there's that wonderful paradox that runs through the story of the Scriptures. That God selects these human beings to lift them up. That's what makes them righteous, even though they all carry within them the flaw of their humanity. Right? And so life becomes this journey of discovery of both what is broken about us and what is beloved about us. And how amazing it is to live in the presence of a God who knows our shortcomings, but yet still chooses us, lifts us up, saves us from disaster, saves us from destruction, just as he saved Noah. And I seem to have lost slide. Okay, here we go. This, however, is, of course, the important part of the story of Noah's Ark. And again, reading this story and not getting the central point means that we really didn't read the story well. At the end of the days of flood, as the water recedes, Noah and his family leave the ark, and this is what happens. God says, this is the sign of the covenant. Here's the first appearance of this terribly important word in the Scriptures. This covenant, this promise, this relationship that God is creating with his people. This is the sign of the covenant that I make between you and me and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Never again. Right? The part of Noah's story, again, is this threat, this fear that somehow our brokenness, the consequence of our brokenness will be total. Yet at the end of the story is also this sense that never again. That no matter how bad things get, there will always be hope because we belong to a God who has made this promise and now will always be faithful to it. Not a calling for us to test God's faithfulness, but a reminder to us that when we feel completely lost, there is always this place to come back to, always this promise waiting for us, and this God who will not forsake the promise that he made for us. This first chapter reading is often what I like to call prehistorical material, because this material all exists prior to the beginning of written language, particularly for the Hebrew people. All of the things in these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis predate written language, which means that they are carried by the community from generation to generation. They're carried orally. They're stories told from parents to children and on from generation to generation. These stories were important enough, or so deeply imprinted on the hearts and minds of people, that they knew they had to pass them along to be kept, to be remembered. That means, one, that they come with a different mindset. And it is always important for us not to impose our modern thinking on this prehistorical material. At the same time, that's the beauty and wonder of them, that these are the first things that people thought and considered in their journey of faith. Sometimes we use this word, teleological, which means how we understand things, or how things come to be understood. And as you read these first 11 chapters, what I want you to do is I want you to imagine a child asking a grandparent, "Grandma, what does the rainbow in the sky mean after a rain?" And Grandma then telling the story of the great flood and Noah and his family and the ark and the animals and all of that. Because that's really what these stories do. They answer this question, what does this mean? Grandma, why do people do bad things? Grandma, why do we eat these plants and not these plants? Why is this like this? That's really the point and the purpose of these stories in particular. Really the point, of course, of all of the stories and events of the Bible, but especially these very ancient stories. Why they ask the most basic questions about the meaning of life and the world. And part of what I think is wonderful to try as we read them is to imagine ourselves in those ancient times, in those ancient contexts, trying to understand the world as if we were just children seeing things for the first time. Now, you and I come to them as modern people. We know why the sky is blue, and we can explain that scientifically, and we know what a rainbow is. It's light refracting through the water vapors left after a rainstorm, right? Sadly, somehow that robs us of the beauty and the innocence of these ancient stories. As you read this first chapter, I would invite you really to try to do that, to try to put yourself back in that place, in that very childlike, innocent kind of place, and ask those questions, and then see what kind of God you discover in that reading. That's the first 11 chapters. Next week we'll be reading chapter 2, God Builds a Nation. We'll start with the story of Abram and how God calls his people together and starts what will become the first family, what will become our family in due time. As always, if you have questions or thoughts, leave them in the comment section here on the Facebook page, or reach out to me directly. I would love to have further conversations with you as well. In the meantime, join me next Wednesday night at 6 o'clock for chapter 2, and take care and have a great week.